Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give people another minute to sign on and then we can get started. Okay. So good afternoon. My name is Judy Chan. I'm the Deputy Director of Digital Services at C2C. Thank you all for being here today. This is the fourth and final meeting of the Cradle-to-Career Workforce Data Expansion Task Force. Thank you for joining us and continuing the work of the task force. Over the last several months, the task force has had an opportunity to provide feedback on specific workforce data elements and sources to include in the data system, as well as ideas for visualizations that could be helpful. Today's meeting, next slide, please. We'll talk about sharing this information with C2C's governing board and finalizing the draft report with final recommendations that will be presented to the board as well as posted publicly. As a note, meeting materials can be found on the C2C task force page. Next slide. I'll review a bit of housekeeping first. As a reminder, throughout the meeting, task force members have access to chat, so you'll be able to comment verbally or via chat. For members of the public, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom right corner of your screen to pose questions. And you can also submit questions to info@c2c.ca.gov. We encourage you to submit your questions, but please note that our team may not be able to get to all of them today, but submit them anyway because they'll be helpful for informing the content for future meetings. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our facilitator, Kathy Booth from Westside, who can take us through today's meeting. Thank you.
All right. So again, I want to remind anyone who's dialing in that we have ongoing notes for all of the meeting that are posted at the link that's on your screen right now. So we just have one long document where we keep adding to what happened in the previous meeting. So in our last meeting, we had to do a really difficult task, which was to prioritize. So in essence, over the course of prior meetings, both in reaction to the proposed data points from the labor agency, and then also ideas that have been generated by this group, we had a really, really long list of potential data points that could be included in the Cradle-to-Career analytical data set so that we could better understand workforce-related topics. So what the group did is go through that list and prioritized what would be most important for the governing board to consider in order to really make the data that's being generated as useful as possible. And so what you focused on was employment information. And so you looked at that in a couple of different ways, that there could be ways to make the data that is already in the data system even better. So just as a reminder, there already is a match to the state wage file that's part of the existing analytical data set. But what you all noted is that that could be made even better if information collected from employers was expanded to include information like where people are working, how many hours they're working, and what their specific occupation is. You also talked about the value of bringing in information from the franchise tax board, because that would have not only information on people that are self-employed, but you'd also be able to potentially also get at some of those value data points like occupation, but also family status and household income. You'd also be able to figure out where people live, which could be useful. It's similar to the location of work to be able to calculate living wages. And finally, you identified a number of ways that enriching the data set with information from the Department of Motor Vehicles could, again, make it easier to figure out where people live, to do those living wage calculations, making the match process more effective, and then also figure out who has a driver's license, which is a really important criteria for jobs. And then the second thing that you all prioritized was information on corrections. So basically things related to people who have been incarcerated and their status as they're moving through that system and back out into society. And so there was a pretty long list there. So there was a general recommendation that that maybe be a data source that gets explored further. So those were the major highlights from the prior meeting. And so what we're going to be doing today is really focusing on taking all of the content of what you've discussed in the prior three meetings and generating a clear set of recommendations to the board. So basically the purpose of this task force was to make sure that there was community and expert voice to help the governing board think about the expansion of the analytical data set to be able to do its work. So I want to hand the floor over to Marianne Bates, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Cradle-to-Career Data, to talk a little bit more about what it means to report to the governing board.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate that. So, for context, as you may know, we have a governing board for the Cradle to Career data system that has 21 individuals on it. Of those, about half are designees of the data providers, um, and the other half are appointees of the governor's office, of the legislature, and we also have an assembly member and a senator on the board. And so that 21-person body is the entity that's charged in statute in making decisions about the data system. That includes adding new data partners or adding new data points. It includes directing the work of the office, directing my work as the executive director, and helping us prioritize amongst the many, many things we could do, which are the highest priority ones for us to tackle in any given year, and how does that align with the priorities that the governing board comes to collaboratively in their public meetings together with input from the public. So what I'll talk about in this section is how your report to the governing board can essentially inform their thinking, both at their upcoming meeting in May and over time as they think about how to weigh which dashboards we work on in the future, how we prioritize the work of building a secure data enclave, how we prioritize working with data we already have versus bringing in new and additional data. So those are all trade-offs that they think through, and a process that will undergo. So if we can go to the next slide, I will walk through some of these steps. So the topics for the recommendations are in a couple of areas. One is insights about the data points that Labor and Workforce Development Agency intends to provide. And that includes a lot of information that you've discussed here in these meetings, and that was really kicked off with the memo from Secretary Knox that we used as a foundation here early on in this task force. So that included potential research questions that could be answered. I just want to highlight again how useful it is that you've thought about this work in this way and prioritizing not only here's the data that you think would be helpful, but really leading with the why. What are the key priority questions that we can't answer well right now as a state, but that we could answer if the following data points were brought together in one place? So that's really important, the learning agenda and those research questions. The second part is the potential users of this information. So I've really enjoyed hearing your input and your ideas on how different stakeholders across the state may use this information in different use cases. And then the third part is ways information could be visualized. So taking that next step and imagining if these data were brought together in the following way, here are the kinds of visualizations that could be powered. Here are the kinds of tools that could be built with that. And then the second category here is additional sources of data beyond labor and workforce, development agency's own data, additional data sources that you would recommend prioritizing to answer workforce-related questions and why you would prioritize them. And then the third category is around useful information that C2C could potentially provide to the proposed California Education Interagency Council to enhance labor market analyses. So those are the broad topics for the recommendations. Next slide, please. So the board meeting that's happening on May 9th, we have a number of individuals who've agreed to be a part of that report out, including Tilvan Wachter, John Watson, and Javier Romero. Many thanks to the team who will be sharing these recommendations. The board meeting is held on May 9th. It starts in the morning around 9:30. We publicly post the agenda for that. And any of you on the task force and any of you who are listening in as a member of the public, you're welcome to join and observe that public meeting. We host it in Sacramento and always also make those available on Zoom. So it will be easy for you to listen in to that conversation regardless of where you're at. So that meeting will be held on May 9th. We post the materials at least 10 days in advance, as we do with our public meetings here in California. So really welcome you to join that conversation. And the process for presenting to the governing board, let me talk through how those presentations work and then potential action by the board. So action by the board means the board takes a vote. When you think about the work of the governing board, a lot of it is deliberative, where they have conversations and discussions and different board members raise different ideas. When it comes to taking a specific decision, for example, requesting new data from data partners or adding a new department or agency as a data provider to the data system, any decision like that happens through a formal vote that the board takes on a noticed agenda in advance. So the next steps for this meeting on May 9th is that this task force team is going to present your recommendations to the board on May 9th. The board then, over the whole course of the year, but especially in its August meetings each year, prioritizes the work the office does and directs our work as well. So we propose a draft work plan, the board adopts and approves it and discusses it, where we say in the upcoming fiscal year, here are the things that we plan to tackle. And the considerations for expanding our scope, right, by bringing in more data on workforce, both from labor and workforce development agencies, entities, or beyond that, the board considers that based on the needs of Californians, the alignment with the mission, and timelines determined based on how the board is prioritizing our work in the face of trade-offs in staffing and resource constraints. So that's a long-winded way of saying that the board may take some votes in the May meeting related to this work. They may take votes in future meetings related to this work. But your report will become an artifact that they can draw on and point to. Like all similar artifacts, we post these on our website, and so it can be pointed to over time. And wanted to just provide the overall context that the board takes action in its quarterly meetings. Some action may happen soon, some action may happen in the future, and that's up to the board to decide. So that's kind of an overview of the process, and happy to answer any questions the task force may have. And I'll turn it back over to Kathy.
Are there any questions for Marianne? Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for clarifying how this task force work fits into the ongoing work of the office. All right. So let's move to the meat of the meeting. And what we want to do is get your input on the draft report of recommendations. So for clarity about where this document came from, basically WestEd went through all of the notes from all of the meetings and just sort of grouped together the information. We also went at great length through the documents that you created, because there was all those different places where you were able to put in input directly related to various research questions or various questions that were raised during the process. And so that's sort of how we got to this point of the recommendations. So because this was an effort of interpretation, there may be places where you want to make a correction, or you might have noticed that something didn't get reflected in the way that you had thought. So this is the chance to do that. So this is very much a work in progress. So I think the best way for us to do this is for me to share my screen and do live edits. So Rosia is going to put in the chat, for those of you that are members of the task force, a link so you can open up this Google Doc at the same time, just so that you can see it better. Right now it's set with a commenting function for you all if you want to be able to put in comments. And also for folks and members of the public, everyone on this task force has had this document for a week. So this is not the first time they're seeing it. But I thought this was the best way for us to get the input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to move us to the document itself. Fantastic. I see a bunch of you are already in it. And I'll go back to sharing. So is the text large enough that people can see it okay? I'm seeing some nodding heads. Fantastic. All right. So let's just sort of scroll through this together slowly. So the beginning is just a background. It's sort of explaining the reason that the task force was convened, which had to do with the fact that this was a recommendation from the planning process that we were now taking action on. And then it says that we had this task force, and it lists all of you. So if we got your name wrong in any way. I know Terrence, you shifted jobs partway through, so we tried to capture your current employment. If there's any corrections that we need to make here, please let me know. And you can unmute, or actually, I think I've lost my chat window. Yeah, now I can see it. All looking good? Saying no, yes. All right. So then we get down to the recommendations. So the first part, as Marianne outlined, was your reaction to the memo put forward from Secretary Knox about the data points that the labor agency intends to share. And so basically, we're indicating that you saw that memo and that you thought that they would be a useful set of recommendations. So I'm going to pause there and see if this characterization feels okay to everyone on the task force. Thank you, Annalise. I'll make that correction. Annalise was correcting her institution. Okay, so then moving on, we're now indicating that in addition to the many research questions that the labor agency identified, you found other types of analyses that might be possible. And so what we have here is a bulleted list that goes on from one page to the next. And I'm going to just sort of clarify that the way that we got to these items is that remember you had those Google documents. So I was literally going in and pulling in the questions that you listed. So I'm going to give everyone a moment to take a look at those. Alexa will also fix your institution. Go back up to the top. Are there any edits you want to make to the questions? Any on this first screen? I'm seeing heads shaking no. Do people need more time to read? And then on this screen, any edits you'd want to make to these questions? Hey, Terrence, what's up?
So I'm looking at this first bank and it might be later, and I might be missing it. So this is why I'm gonna ask it. So I was wondering about outcomes, wage outcome equity by demographic. That's an explicit charge of, for example, the COEs to work on that, the centers of excellence for the community colleges. Am I missing it?
I'm just looking right now. So we have workforce program outcomes. So that has to do with the workforce program and not their earnings. So we've got differences by community college and justice involvement, but I don't think we have that specific question. So how would you frame that? What are the employment outcomes? Is there a particular people? Are you thinking of community college programs in particular?
I guess I was being inspired by community college programs, but it doesn't have to be restricted to that. So, are there equity gaps in wages by occupation.
By occupation, so we don't have occupational data right now in what's there. You could have it by industry.
Or industry, yeah, or even just leave it. Are there equity gaps in wages? That would be good enough just
Okay.
to
For a specific
guide the inquiry. I would say at least gender and ethnicity. The literature really focuses on gender primarily, but there is some on ethnicity as well. There's a boatload of other characteristics, but that's always a good start.
So I've made the wording, are there equity gaps in wages for specific populations, including gender and race/ethnicity? Does that sound right?
That sounds good. Thank you.
Absolutely. Are there other edits that people want to make to this list? Are you ready to move on? Saying nodding heads. Okay, so we're going to go next to this. The next topic had to do with actually visualizing the data. And that began with you all identifying who would be the users of this expanded data set. So you specifically named policymakers, researchers, education and training providers, employers, unions and community members, and individuals. So I'd love you to take a moment and just read through that and make sure that we've captured the way that you believe that this data set would be useful for each population. How's this list looking to you? Are there places where you're seeing anything that's missing? Go ahead, Jeff.
I just wanted to, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Note that it seems like for the researchers, there's a lot more that could be, it's very narrow in the statement about what it could be used for. There's like a lot more to add there and just wondering why identifying that those one or two points when I think the applications are much broader.
I think it had to do with what we found in the notes that you all had written during the meeting. So if you want to go ahead and embellish on this list right now, it would be great to add those things. So what would be top of mind for you?
Gosh, you're putting me on the spot. I mean, I think we'd want to know some of the answers to a variety of those identified research questions above, like effectiveness of also, not only do the education training providers need to know, are their programs effective? I think that's helpful for researchers to understand too. And also, really focused on equity gaps, as Terrence spoke to earlier. So I think there's like just a lot of applications. Um, Given time, I could probably say more things, but I'll defer to others.
So I'd love to hear if other people have immediate things that they're thinking the research community could use that we could add to this list. And we can also do a for example, given that if I know researchers, you all have infinite questions. Annalise, do you have something that's specific to researchers or do you have another topic?
Yeah, I could definitely add to that list. I think I had another question, but or comment, but I think one thing that it could do is provide information to researchers on how how different occupations are changing and growing, especially with things such as the deployment of AI, and how to identify like geographic regions where there are particularly um, strong trends in certain industries or occupations.
So I want to clarify that this part, we're reflecting on the data points that the labor agency said they would provide. We don't actually have projections for job openings or job skills in that list. So there might be some information on the skills that are being taught in the particular programs that are training specific, but I don't think that's going to get at the level of projecting employment needs.
So you
So
can see what occupations are growing and what are declining, right?
not in the data set that the labor agency is proposing to give. That's largely giving you information on the people that are participating in workforce programs. And you would have proposed in there is the whether they got jobs and what they earned after participating in those programs, but it does not give you information on projected labor market demand. It's not there. There is a data set that EDD holds that has projections of what employers think, which jobs they think they're going to hire, how many job openings, how much they pay people, but that was not part of the data set that was proposed by the labor agency.
Okay, I thought you said something about the wage data, the employment data before. So
Oh, that's a really good clarifying question. People often conflate the two. So what we have is there's a file that's generated by employers that says for everybody who worked for us in the past, this is how much we paid them in each fiscal quarter. And that information
right.
is matched. So that's giving us backwards looking information. So somebody finished a welding program, were they employed and what were they earning, but it doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the future. So you're thinking like retroactive, just understanding the employment outcomes of prior participants?
I'm talking about wage and employment trends that you can determine from the wage records. That's all.
Okay,
I mean,
so
I know
looking
what
back.
the wage records are, but I'm talking about you can tell a lot from the wage records. You can tell what's happening. Obviously, it's often delayed, but having uh, that data can tell you a lot about the economy and how it's changing, even if it's backward looking.
Thank you so much for that clarification.
It
What
can
was
tell you where certain jobs are concentrated and where certain industries are concentrated, what earnings are in different regions, etc.
Thank you for that clarification. What was the point that you were going to raise?
For the training and education providers, I think that it's missing information about updating their programs to reflect the current need.
You're right. We have designing here and not updating programs. So if I said updating programs to meet emerging needs, does that seem right? Or would you state that differently?
Yeah.
Great. Any other ways you would suggest amending this?
That's all I have for now. I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Wonderful. Yes, Terrence.
I might be missing it. Another thought that came to mind about use case scenarios for the data would be resource development. To what extent might people be able to use the information either to apply for a grant or develop a public-private partnership or other means of resource development?
So I'm going to add for education and training providers, support resource development. And I'm going to add
Yeah, there we go.
a support partnership development. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, think about examples like apprenticeship programs or internships for healthcare workers and things like that.
Why don't we make that?
Which we don't have to name explicitly, but just so you all know where I'm coming from.
So we should partnerships with employers and community organizations. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, because that's a good point. Like if you're like working with a nonprofit that does, for example, teaching English, and you might have a student who's learning to be a teacher get an internship with a nonprofit. We just made that bullet point really long, didn't we?
It's okay. We're showing the value, and it's good to have all that listed. Abby.
Yeah, just to build on what Terrence was saying, because I think you made a really important point I'm not sure is captured here. Some of these researchers, this data could make the case for funding. It would help nonprofits and colleges, and I'm losing my internet connection here on the train. Could use it could show strong outcomes, could help make the case for funding.
I'm going to add that, but for researchers. So we've got show strong outcomes.
And for education and training providers, sorry.
Yeah, I've got that down for here, enhanced resource development. Do you want me to say like in fundraising? Because people might not know what we mean by that.
You could add and fundraising or just specifically grant requests, but I think resource development is pretty widely used and understood.
So enhanced resource development is sufficient. Okay, great. Any other edits before we move on? Okay. So the next section had to do with that visualization. So basically, earlier we sort of stated that you recommended that the office use a user-centered design approach where you're really looking at the people and what it is they need specifically. And then what you did is you came up with some possible ways that the data could be visualized based on your experience working with the potential users of the data, including yourselves. So what I did is I tried to distill themes because you all listed lots and lots of types of things related to visualizations. So the themes that I heard or saw in your write-ups were basically the first is the cross-agency outcomes. And there are some specific examples that you generated. So you might show the proportion of students who took career technical education in high school, who then went on into LWDA workforce training, and then what their employment outcomes were with lots of disaggregations, including by demographics, industry, and location. And another idea that you had written out was dashboards for major initiatives like the K-16 regional collaboratives that would show rates of college going, transfer, graduation, employment, and wage gains. So you're really following that long-term arc. Any comments on these visualizations before we move on to program comparisons? Yes, Javier. Oops, you're on mute.
So that was my practice run. Okay, I'm ready now. One thing that we're very interested in is that the workforce system become an access point to higher education attainment levels. So conversely to the first bullet, it's like our workforce program trainings result in people entering into higher education, the frequency of that. I mean, the concept is if we're going to focus on populations that are buried, more than likely our 18-month program, is it going to be sufficient to change that trajectory? So it could be an access point to further education goals.
Great. So what I've put in here is the proportion of workforce training participants who enter post-secondary education. And then I'm presuming you're going to want similar disaggregation as others mentioned. So I've got demographics, industry, and location. would program type be something that you would add to that for looking at the different WIOA funded
Absolutely.
programs?
Yes, thank you for that.
Great. Liza.
Yeah, just to complement that and also into apprenticeship programs, especially thinking how much the workforce system, funds the pre-apprentice and those kind of programs.
So the apprenticeship data set is actually considered a workforce training program in the way these things are created. So are you looking at connections between short-term training programs and apprenticeship and post-secondary?
Both, just calling out apprenticeship programs and what you just wrote, I think just helps make sure that connection is there. And there's already a lot of investment into that by the system. So just making sure
Maybe
those
so,
outcomes.
so maybe it's the proportion of participants in short-term workforce training programs who enter post-secondary education and apprenticeships.
Yes.
Oh, wait, am I typing incorrectly here? Yes, I am not. Javier, does that work for you?
It does. It does. And just to echo Cesar, though apprenticeship is considered a workforce program, really, it's an employment outcome. They're employed at that point. So a short term could be a pre-apprenticeship program and so on. So yeah, just wanted to echo Cesar's point. Great, great addition, Cesar.
Thank you. Jill.
Oh, I just wanted to flag, like, for the first bullet, that potentially missing students from high school straight to workforce training, but not capturing any kind of post-secondary training in there, which, coming from the community college system, would be interested in also including that there
Okay.
as a component.
I'm gonna do and or community college. Because I know there was definitely a question that was posed by one of you that was thinking about people that forego post-secondary altogether, and goes straight into the workforce, and then their way back in is through a workforce training program. Or do we want two different bullets because those are different experiences? What would help what tells this, what would help people make a decision based on those two different possibilities?
Well, I think there's some swirl too, right? Where, I mean, that's sort of the question as well. I mean, I think that's a valid question about straight from high school into workforce training. But there's also a question about, well, do they go to community college and then go to work? Like, there's it's not a linear pathway necessarily. And so just wondering about how the interplay there. So if it's another bullet, I think that's also fine, but just didn't want to not include post-secondary here because it seemed like a bit of an oversight. Even though it's included so in the K-16 below, but
Because actually, I think that third bullet reflects the idea that you'd have initiative-specific dashboards. But I actually hear you talking about something different, which is analogous to the student pathway diagram that is the first product for C2C, which is saying, here are high school students and do they go to college and do they go into the workforce? And you're saying, take CTE students and see what is, if you could imagine like a Sankey diagram, like how many are going into post-secondary and when does workforce training fit in? So in essence, you're trying to understand the relationship of course order between or participation between those three things, which would be K-12, workforce training, and post-secondary. Do I have that right?
I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I didn't know if I thought about it as deeply as that, but just thinking about that it was not included just seemed like it should be post-secondary should be included in some way, whether or not it's in that bullet or otherwise. And so because I do think there's a lot of interest in our system about the relationship between high school and community college, CTE specifically, and then also really a lot of interest between how workforce training and community college, and if that training is happening at the community college, right? So there's some interest in there from our system.
So if I rewrite this to say the proportion of students who took career technical education in high school who subsequently enrolled in post-secondary and their employment outcomes, is that sufficient, or do you want more in that descriptor? Like, do you want it to be community college specific?
I don't think it necessarily needs to be community college specific. I think it's that in so there's a lot of directions you could go. And so in a bullet point, hard to capture all of the possibilities, but I think that satisfies my need to see like post-secondary a bit more represented, I guess, in this list.
That's great. And that's a really good reminder, Jill, that these are sort of like directional signage for the user-centered design process where you're not being expected to do a comprehensive design for a visualization, but you're raising issues of things that could be well visualized. So I want to acknowledge that, Javier, you raised your hand somewhere through this. Did you have a comment on this point, or do you have a separate point?
Yeah, to this point, I mean, I think it is a matter of interest, the frequency in which you have somebody taking career technical education in high school, and then they pursue it to a community college, and they continue on that place at community college. So how often that happens, because we do want people not just to think of post-secondary as a way to, get to the 4-year degree, but they could advance their education goal, career goals by pursuing post-secondary for career technical education as well. So I think that question in itself is something of interest to us all.
And so are you interested specifically about whether they're continuing in CTE once they go to post-secondary?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. My vote would be like another bullet saying that.
Watch the list expand. Okay. I'm the reason I'm pausing is I'm remembering what's in the specifications for the college going dashboard. And I remember there was a lot of discussions about this in the planning process. So what I want to do is just take a moment and say, like, you want to know whether students continue in the same field of study. The thing I want to pause for a moment and point out is that the intention of this is to talk about how the workforce data could be used. So I just want to flag, I'm noticing that this doesn't have any reference to workforce data.
And I did remember that halfway through my comment.
Yeah. So Jill, let's actually, I feel like we have to amend this because that is a useful thing, but it is not about the workforce data. So is there a way in which you would want to understand how workforce training programs or workforce program participation fits into this connection between K-12, CTE, and post-secondary?
I mean, I think there is, given that, and maybe it's covered, like that some of the workforce training is community college programs. And maybe it's covered in there, but yeah, I think it's not like again, back to my point, it's like not always a very linear journey for the students. So it's like, are you not counting? Anyway, yeah, but I'm just trying to think about how to represent that because I think there's some interest there and specific to workforce related programs.
Yeah.
And maybe if it's covered in other areas of C2C visualization, like that's also fine.
Okay. That's a really other useful thing, and I'll get to you in just a second, Annalise, is that when we're talking about workforce here, we are talking specifically about the data that's coming from the labor agency. So it's confusing because yes, there is workforce related programming that happens in the community colleges, but we're specifically talking about the data that's coming from the things that are funded in essence through the labor agency. So the way I think that we might capture this rather complex idea would be the proportion of students who took CTE in high school who then were in the LWDA-based programs, whether they went to post-secondary and their employment outcomes. So that leaves the possibility that we're looking at this relationship amongst the three places where one could get training, meaning K-12, things that are funded by the labor agency, and things that are in the post-secondary realm. And that, I know those lines are already blurring, but that might help us get to the answer. Does that feel right?
Yeah, and I guess if you're looking at it as a piece of a pie, like what does it tell you that they went to workforce training at LWDA, but that you would want to know how many went to post-secondary. Because there's, if you're looking, I mean, I would think that you would want to know that, because telling you that percentage without understanding where the other students went.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of that, in some ways?
That's helpful. And at least you've been so patient. What was the
That's
theme
fine.
to share?
Well, relevant to this discussion, I wonder if it might make sense to reframe it a little bit, because if you're thinking about someone's training and education and post-secondary, if you're following the person, then you have a learning and employment record for that individual that might be attached to their digital identity. And you can then have a data set that tags whatever education or training they have received over many years. And then you can use AI and other data analytics to identify patterns in where are people going? Are there permeable pathways across different programs? Where are you seeing those co-enrollments happen and the outcomes of that? Like, you could do all kinds of data analytics that follow people regardless of, I worry that we were thinking about this as sort of overly structuring certain pathways that we think are promising, rather than creating a data set that you can explore and use data analytics to find patterns, and then really build out non-linear ways that people are accessing opportunity. In other words, not like sort of determining the patterns from the outside, but allowing the data to show you the patterns. And we can't do that if you don't have a digital record of someone's experiences that follows the person throughout different systems. So anyway, just a thought about how we're approaching this. I worry that we're kind of like imposing what we think people should do, instead of seeing what people are doing and whether there are gaps in, one of the key metrics we want to pay attention to, right, is tracking. Like, are people being tracked away from college? Are there certain occupations where people are getting stuck and not pursuing any additional training or any additional education, right? Those are things that I think have a lot of policy relevance. But presupposing what we think people should do is a little bit problematic, in my opinion. And then my other comment was, I think one thing to also might be worth tracking is apprenticeship degrees. Like, because, if you're doing a teaching apprenticeship and you have to get a degree to be a teacher, are we seeing growth in those kinds of opportunities where people are pursuing both an apprenticeship and a post-secondary degree? So those kinds of cross-agency outcomes could help show some growth in certain industries.
Okay. So this is so helpful. So Emily, I think I now understand better what you were saying earlier. So I've made some edits to that bullet point. So basically you're saying, and we need to pull apart two different functions of what C2C data set can do. So you're really describing a research agenda where you're going in and you're looking at what people actually do as a way to get a much more nuanced understanding of the relationship between school, college, training, and work. So I've tried to make that more, so clarify patterns in individuals' participation in education, workforce training, employment, and earnings as a way to understand the economy. Does that better capture what you just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about structuring the data so that it's tied to the individual through a lifetime. And that person could even access that in their own app on their wallet, on their phone, right? And show that, yeah, they can verify they went to this school and got that certificate. But also, as a data analytics on the back end, you can then have all this data that is set up that links individuals to all their different enrollments and can tell you useful information about what we're trying to picture here. So you might have a dashboard and you might have certain questions, but you can evolve that dashboard over time as you observe different patterns or as you start to see things emerge that are, growing, and it doesn't become like a static thing that we're imposing on the data, if that makes sense.
It does. And what might be helpful to clarify about the way the data system is evolving is that the underlying data set is doing exactly the thing that you are hoping it would, which is it's saying, here's Kathy, and here's what we know about her from all of these different entities, so that you can create that really comprehensive understanding of an individual's experience. That creates an analytical data set from which the identities are removed. So now you don't know it's Kathy. You would just know that there was a person and this is the stuff that happened to them. And that data set can be used in different ways. So you can do a research request process on it and do the analysis that you just described, or you can take a slice of it and you can turn it into a dashboard. And so I want to make sure that we're all clear that this section down here about visualizations are specifically about some of the things that would be most useful to be putting into a dashboard format. So that does not begin to touch the power of what you just described. It doesn't address the issue of having a record that I control, but it's literally like, if we have this big data set, what goes in public view? As a reminder, the recommendation from you all is that there should be a user-centered design process where people really figure out what they need to know. And here, just like some tasty tidbits of the types of things that you all think might be most valuable right now for the types of conversations that are happening where a dashboard is an appropriate way to display that information.
Right. So like in application, what I mean is, let's say you can say, are CNAs getting RNs?
Mhm.
And we know employers want that to happen or whatever. We know educators want that to happen. No, they're not. Let's do this thing to make sure that we see that data change, right? You can't really tell that from just one data set. And so that's the kind of thing that you wouldn't be able to know to ask until you had the data that way. So
Yep,
I hope that helps.
that does really help. Thank you so much. Cesar, what were you going to say?
Yeah, just to kind of complement that, it just I agree, figuring out what the pathways are and definitely making sure that we track people's paths to it, and that would help identify gaps. But I also want to take it a step further and figure out retention of careers as well. Understanding if we see patterns to say if somebody went through a kind of high school course, community college, and then apprenticeship program into healthcare, those workers tend to stay there compared to others, or kind of I don't want to dictate outcomes, but it would be great to see the data set on that to also identify gaps that where we should be investing in, if we need more nurses or if we need more engineers or if we need more uh, pathways.
So I'm going to move us down to employment and outcomes to try to capture this. Okay, so we were just talking right now about like the cross-agency outcomes. So what we have down here are two existing bullet points about the employment outcomes. So one of the things you all said was long-term earnings for students who participated in CTE while in high school based on based on their college and career preparation level. So that was a question that one of you raised. Another was the long-term outcomes of completers of specific education and training programs, including employment. And here's where we have job retention, earnings gains, and receipt of public benefits, and how those changed when they got more education and training. So this is really about whether a program seems to be well aligned for the long-term outcomes. It feels to me like, Cesar, what you were describing is really almost focused more on the employer of saying, do we know if people stay in, if we take an industry as the slice and say, are people staying in these occupations? Is that the insight you're asking for, or is that covered?
Yeah, not necessarily employers, which is I think they'll benefit from it, but it's occupations and sectors.
Okay, so we don't have occupational data. We'll have industry data. So you can know what somebody trained in, and you can know the industry of their employer, but we don't have occupational data. Does that change what you would ask for?
I think it's interconnected, depending on what certificates or what education pathway they're getting into would kind of identify that already. So I don't know if it needs to be called out.
Okay, so I think that that's covered here. That we're starting with the program and then we're looking at job retention. So it's not just did you get a job, but did you stay in the job? Is that right?
And how they got there, looking at the different pathways on how somebody got there. is
Yes.
important.
Yes, I think we've got that. Great. Terrence.
I'm gonna piggyback off of what Annalise said. Could you remind us, I know we went over this as our fourth meeting, I should remember, but could you remind us why we don't have occupation data?
I can. So the information that we have about employment comes from a file that employers send to the Employment Development Department. And right now, the things that they report is Terrence worked for me in this fiscal quarter, and this is how much I paid him. And that's it. And we know the industry because there's a record for the employer that says Terrence works in education, or actually government. So that is all we have right now. So if you want to have occupational data, your choices are to ask every employer in the state to start saying, this is Terrence's occupational code. Or you have to get to the Franchise Tax Board and pull from the file where you write down what your job title is when you file your taxes. And that's, or you have, you know, the CTE outcome survey, which I think at one point asked for job title. I don't know that it still does. I think it does ask for occupation, but that's only for community college CTE programs.
Great, thank you for the reminder. And I also thank you for bringing up Sankey diagrams. I heard that loud and clear and looking forward to seeing those.
Please.
Have we dropped the idea of trying to get census data based on our last conversation? Because that would include occupation and industry.
Yes. So what we determined from some of the folks that were in the room is that while there are things like the post-secondary employment outcomes data set that comes from census, that you can't match to individual records. So you couldn't get to a place where, going back to Annalise's point, that you want one big record for each person. You can't attach that data right now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. I want to make sure that we, I'm going to note something in chat since people from the public can't see this. Annalise said it's really important that we have the occupational data, and there's a big push for UI, which is actually something we're going to cover further down in your recommendations. So I don't want to get too lost in this. Just having spent a moment looking at these potential visualizations, is there anything else critical that you want to have listed now, knowing that there would be other opportunities once the data is actually in hand? Okay, I'm seeing that it's okay to go on. All right, so this is now where we're going to start talking about this issue about additional data. So basically, the first thing that you all said is that, yes, it would be really helpful to have other data points. We agree with the labor agency, but that we can only do so much right now. So you're telling the governing board what you think is most important. And so what you said was that reliable individual level data on earnings was the first thing that you really wanted to know. And in this, you were reflecting on the fact that that state wage file is missing people who are self-employed or work for federal government, or there's a whole host of people that aren't included in that state wage files. And so you said that would be important first. And then you also said you need to know where people live, and gave some reasons for that. And then you said that you really needed to have the information on occupation. And then here listed are the three places that you all discussed. So the first was enhancing the state wage file. So to Annalise's point in chat, the idea of this national push to get employers to put those records in. One of you mentioned the JEDX standards. And so you were sort of like highlighting the things that were said in the meetings about that. The second one being the Franchise Tax Board, and the third being DMV. So I want to just take a moment and have you, I'm going to actually go back up to the framing and see if all this language looks okay to you, or if there's any amendments you want to make to this part. Is that looking okay to everybody?
Kathy, there's a clarification question in the chat from Jill about the data points. And just to clarify, these are the data points that the task force has suggested in addition to the ones from LWDA.
So there's overlap. In some of these, the labor agency indicated they also hoped for more expansive employment data, but this is the way that I heard you all talking about it, or what you wrote into those Google Docs about your thoughts about those various things. So, for example, the labor agency did not mention the JEDEX standards. That was something that came out of one of the documents.
I guess my question was about, in the original memo, there was a list of data elements that the labor agency wanted from other sources, and those are also happening. These are happening in addition to those.
So the ask that was made of the task force, because you all came up with dozens of additional data points above and beyond what the labor agency had prioritized. We looked at all those things, everything the labor agency had said, everything that you all had generated, and the activity last time was you all said of all those things, if you could only pick a couple, what would you do first? And that my understanding from the notes was that your first big push was better employment data, employment and earnings data. And then your second big push, which we'll talk about in a second, was the information on incarceration.
So I was just wondering, does that mean that we're not gonna, the data points that were requested by our labor agency have fallen down on the priority list? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, the issue is that the point of this portion is you telling the governing board what
Okay.
you all in your space from expertise think would be most important. Because, I mean, the labor agency can absolutely say to other entities in the state that they really wish that they would put data in. But having you all weigh in to say where you would focus first doesn't mean that you're precluding the other data points. And I tried to have language in there that indicated that you were just as excited as the labor agency about a lot of those data points, but that this is where you would recommend that the focus be. So it's very important that this reflects what the priorities you believe are. This is what I took from our notes from last time, but this is your space to make the call. Do you want to take this sort of in chunks? Like, are there any edits that you want to make to the statement about earnings data? You can see folks moving through the document. Do you want to just sort of do a thumbs up that you're feeling okay about this first paragraph on the earnings data? I'm seeing some thumbs up. Nods. Okay. All right. So then the second one had to do with the location of where people live. Is this language okay? Seeing nods. Right, thank you very much I've got some notes in chat. Okay, and then finally, we talked about employment, and we've got the three areas here, which is gathering more information from employers, getting data from the Franchise Tax Board, and working from DMV. Is that language all looking good to you all? Saying nods from Alex. Saying nods.
And this is the part where if I had looked ahead, I would have seen my question was already answered.
Yep. But it's always a good moment to remind people why we don't have the difference. When I first started working with labor market information and someone was trying to explain the difference between an occupation and an industry to me, it was not obvious. And it made me realize that the language we use colloquially to talk about these concepts doesn't line up with the data sources. And that can make it really hard to hold on to what we can and can't see at this point. Okay, so it looks like we're okay here. So now we're going to move on to the question of why it's really important to have information about corrections. So we're talking about everything from how that experience could change outcomes to really understanding ways to be more effective at serving people who are incarcerated. Any edits you want to make to this language? Alex is nodding her head. Now we get to the last section, and this is where I think I might have gotten ahead of myself when Annalise was trying to explain the concepts to me, which is about labor market information. So as you may recall, the labor agency talked about the fact that people tend to want to look at projections and not just historical information when they're trying to understand employment outcomes. And we have this really great opportunity in that there is this proposal to create a new council, and the purpose of this council is to be able to give information to explain what's happening in industries, and that they're supposed to do this in concert with Cradle-to-Career. So I really want to make sure that we've got these bullets right, because what Annalise was describing may not be adequately captured here, of that power of being able to have the longitudinal record of an individual and use that to understand how people are really navigating the employment opportunities. So take a minute to look at these bullets. And if there's any edits that we can make to this to make it clearer, like let's go ahead and you can either use the editing function in the document that the task force members have access to, or you can unmute and I can make edits based on your speaking. Annalise.
Yeah, does the data include anything about like credentials? Could there be a question about credential quality in there?
When you say credentials, what do you mean?
It could be non-degree credentials or degrees, but any kind of certificate or diploma or degree or license, like credential quality and different outcomes could help inform, people's choices about programs, but also which programs, like how employers value those credentials. And so I'm just curious. I'm just asking because I don't know.
No.
Is that credential data and the outcomes associated with it part of the data set?
So the credentials that are included would be community college, non-credit and credit certificates. And so adult ed in California is bifurcated, where some's through community college non-credit and some is through K-12 adult schools. The K-12 adult school data is missing from this data set. They're really, so then we have like post-secondary awards, and that would be both by level and by zip code. So your bachelor's and graduate degrees. There is not licensure data. Jill actually suggested that as an item, but it didn't get prioritized as you were looking at all the things that could go in. And it does not have third-party credentialing like a CompTIA certificate or anything like that. That is missing right now from the system. How does that answer your question? Would that change?
Yeah, so I think for the certificates, you do have like having information about the outcomes could help develop like a quality measure for making decisions for a lot of different stakeholders.
Okay, so we have up above for visualizations. Actually, let me backtrack. The community college credential data is already attached to wage records in a tool that's put out by the Chancellor's Office called Data Vista. So right now, anybody, member of the public, could pick it's called a top code instead of a zip code, but they could pick an academic area and be able to see what the earnings outcomes are of individuals who completed those awards. So one of the things that we could add as a bullet, because right now we've got this idea of dashboards with key performance indicators about what those occupations are. Are you suggesting that there also be a dashboard that shows outcomes by programs across institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get at the credentials of value conversation. Like, what are the top credentials in California that are getting the best outcomes, and how can we make sure that, you know, we're prioritizing those if we're making decisions about Leo or whatever? Or if you're an employer, which of these programs is highest quality that I want to, you know, bring in to train my workforce, right? Like measures of making meaningful assertions about program, because there's so many different things out there and people struggle to make sense of it. So how do you leverage the data to communicate which ones are getting the best results and, you know, having the most consistent outcomes?
So what I'm hearing is this analysis of the credential of value by measuring consistent outcomes of specific programs. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So one challenge is that the office just has no research staff. So maybe is provide data for the analysis of credentials of value.
Sure.
Did I get that? So take a look at that bullet and let me know how I can make that better. Maybe we just take this.
I would just say credentials instead of programs, but you know.
Okay.
Would certifications be included in that?
Not right now, because what will go in will be apprenticeship. That's the only certification that I'm aware of that the labor agency manages. Javier, have I got that wrong? Are there any other types of credentials?
And I think you're right.
Yeah, so it will have apprenticeship data, but that's it.
So is there anything in the ETPL that requires the labor agency to collect outcome data on different credentials?
My head, now I think about, yeah, credential attainment is tracked, but I'm not sure if it's for all programs. Yeah, I think the ETPL reporting may include that.
But the ETPL is not currently a
No,
data flag that is going to go into
no.
labor agency's data that goes to C2C. And for those of you who don't know this acronym, it's the Eligible Training Providers List. And it's basically programs that have proven that they generate ongoing value so that federal dollars can be used for retraining purposes.
Just looking at our performance accountability system, and credential attainment is something we track, but it may entail, all sorts of stuff.
And that would change what you'd be putting into the system. So this gives an opening for a larger conversation, so that if C2C was tasked with providing this type of information to the council, at that point, that would probably trigger additional discussions about data points that are not currently available.
Yeah. And my initial thought, top of my head, is I don't know how helpful it'll be such a small population, of those served by WEO and those trained and so on. So
The information that you're planning to provide is the beginning of that.
mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
something.
Oh, no, go ahead. Now you're on mute.
Yeah. No, this to your point, as far as something a bit larger conversation when we talk about when we start sharing information between our, my staff with Cradle-to-Career staff.
Anything else that you want to add on this point?
This is Till, California Police Lab in UCLA. I had a quick question. One thing that C2C has and that provides that has come up in the other task force meeting is information on other complementary programs and services that individuals receive. I'm thinking of, CalFresh, for example, or Medi-Cal, or even CalWorks. Um, and I think that's a particular advantage of this data infrastructure, and also another tool that policymakers can use that go beyond specific training programs to support especially lower income individuals.
So if C2C provided data to the council on learners' participation in public benefit programs, do you want to
I
say?
would probably ideally also eligibility. Right. So the one thing that we've learned from work that the California Policy Lab has done is that many community college students are eligible, but they don't take up. Right. So I would actually probably say providing information on learners' eligibility and participation, and then to inform perhaps outreach or cross-program synergies.
That right? Okay. Providing information on learners' eligibility and participation in public benefit programs to inform efforts to improve outreach. That would be something that the council would do, maybe collaboratively.
Yes, I mean, in the sense of providing that would be then a possible signal to say the community college system and CDSS to see how can we better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cross-agency collaboration.
Yeah.
Annalise.
Just to add to that, I've had a lot of conversations recently, including some in California, about the reporting burden for compliance. I don't know if that fits specifically. Seems like it says recording and reporting here in one of them, but having like alignment around reporting definitions and requirements so that people don't have to report slightly different information to different funders if someone is co-enrolled in something. And that creates a lot of admin burden.
um, thinking specifically about the way C2C's data could support that. So you're saying that C2's data would fulfill the reporting requirements, or that it's because the earlier point is that then you can understand how they're, like, based on what the data are, how it is they're trying to answer these questions and what the differences are. Do you want to go the next step further and say that with this information that they could actually figure out ways to align reporting requirements?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's, for example, people are having to employ a full-time staff person to like enter data in different ways in different systems. So, if there was a way to kind of consolidate and streamline the definitions across programs, then that would save resources all the way down the chain. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Anything else? Terrence?
And that triggered a thought for me because it's a difference between using C2C as a reporting system versus using C2C to inspire consistency of reporting requirements among various entities. And I like that thought. I suppose theoretically, one could say, some funder or some state agency could say, and I want you to improve these KPIs as shown in the C2C system, but I don't, it's probably a little early for that. And it'd be more that the people looking at the data in C2C can help agencies see the different perspectives. Her thought obviously, resonates with me because, working on projects where it's essentially the same thing, improve workforce outcomes, but you have different geographies or different timeframes. And the more consistency that we can have, the better. Because sometimes the difference is they're not really meaningfully different. They're just more different out of tradition. And so that the C2C could be a way to create a consistency and an efficiency. Maybe eventually, 10 years from now, C2C might become a place where, well, you go there to the KPI and that's where you're going to see if you're improving outcomes. Eventually, that's my dream, is having this one central place for that we can all work on, but I'm trying to be kind and not push that too quickly.
Okay, we've got about 6 minutes left, so.
I have one. I don't want to. If you want to move ahead, that's fine. I can send an
No, no,
email
no,
as
no, no,
well.
no. Now is the time. Go ahead and share your thoughts.
Well, one thing, this has become now a very loaded or tricky word, but do we want to say something about the ability to ensure equitable distribution of training and education resources and equitable outcomes across the state?
So
Or
how would do you want to have a specific bullet about addressing equity gaps, or do you want to amend one of these?
that's a bit above my pay grade, I feel, in the sense that, let's see, where do you have demographics and then regional, right? So I guess I pointed out because I thought it was, you could have a dashboard that tries to do, you know, give information on um, employment trends by geography, sector, and demographic groups, I suppose. Demographic and education groups.
We use that language throughout the document, that you're consistently asking for disaggregation by demographics.
Perfect. So yeah, that fits nicely.
We've got about 4 minutes left. So, this is sort of the last call. Just as now that you've looked at this whole document in its entirety, is there anything else you want to make sure that it's in before we finalize?
If this is the last call, the one thing that I was wondering whether we want to talk about job quality um, somewhere or in this final list, or whether it's enough if it's covered elsewhere.
So how would you document job quality?
That was my question.
Not in 4 minutes. But to know which training opportunities lead to high wage jobs. I was actually a little thrown off by the first bullet on the sequence of jobs. That's interesting to me as a researcher. But wouldn't we want to know, um, I can stare at this a little bit and propose something offline if that's fine.
Well, so
I
my
reckon.
concern is this. This is the last meeting of the task force. We really want to make sure that the group is sort of signing off on what's here. So
Fair enough.
so we do have this idea of credentials of value. So we've got consistent outcomes for specific credentials. That could be a place to talk about job quality. I don't know
Well,
that CTC has any data that can help.
I like that. You could broaden it, because why only credentials? You could say of different, you know, educational tracks or degrees, right? So providing data for the analysis of credentials and, you know, degree or whatever you use, tracks, uh, and think about the job and employment and earning outcome of these credentials.
So by job quality, do we mean earnings? Because there aren't a lot of other measures of job quality that are available in these data sets, to my knowledge.
So I would mean jobs. You're absolutely right. B, earnings, a company's earnings often correlates with other good things in terms of job quality, and job stability often does, right? Because people switch out of unpleasant jobs, right? So stable, high-paying jobs is an indicator that captures more than just earnings generally.
Renee.
So like, I mean, like here what we do it is it's more like sustainable careers. So based on census data, you can find out like what career, and we get like economic data too, like what type of wages you need to be able to afford a home here and being able to sustain yourself, right, in the Inland Empire. So I think when I think of job quality is trying to find a job where you are able to sustain that job and have a good living in terms of moving forward. So that's something that we use, and that could be using like census data or economic data to find that out.
So what is going to be available in the C2C data set would be earnings. And you
Okay.
could potentially look at job retention by looking at whether somebody's staying with the same employer. I think that might require a slight modification to the way the wage file is being matched, but I'd have to check on that. But right now, those are the two things. The census data is not part of C2C. So it is a really helpful source of information, but that is not something that's here. And one of the things that you had indicated earlier is that you wanted location, because when you know where someone's living, then you can calculate that cost of living that's regional, Renee, that you were describing. So it's right now it's a proxy. If you were going to try to do it, you're going to say, well, Terrence went to Rio College, and so he must be still living in Santa Cruz, but maybe he's moved to Sacramento and you don't know. So those are some of the tricky things. Lisa.
Another possibility, I mean, we don't have good data on like job dimensions. Other countries do, but United States had some quality of employment surveys in the 70s. I don't think anybody's really tried to do that kind of thing since then. But another possibility might be like average weeks unemployed in the particular industry that would get at, is this a and we're not using occupation, right? So it would have to be industry. That might be another quality indicator that could be available from EDD.
Meaning that you'd ask for the unemployment data in addition to the employment data, because it's a different data. I mean, it's a different data point.
But we do know how many weeks, I mean, not necessarily whether they're getting UI, but how many weeks someone is employed from EDD.
The data point that's currently available is if there's a record in a fiscal quarter and you have no idea the person was employed for one day or every day in the quarter.
So it would have to be the UI data set to get, yeah, that might be really complicated.
But I think you could do job retention from that, just looking to see if they're showing up consistently.
Thanks.
I want to thank all of you so much for all of the thought and care. As today's discussion shows, these are very nuanced things that we're trying to distill down into plain language. So I think that this analysis is going to be really useful. And the fact that we also have all that documentation of your much more detailed notes would be available to the staff as things go forward. So Marianne, do you want to close us out?
Just with a huge amount of gratitude. I know all of you are incredibly busy and it's hard to make time for a task force like this. Your willingness to do that and your willingness to do it in a public meeting where the public can listen in and hear your thoughts is tremendous. So we're deeply grateful and really excited to have these recommendations come to our governing board. So many thanks.